In the heart of West Africa, a young soldier named Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in Burkina Faso with one promise: to protect his people and stand against the chaos tearing his country apart. He was not like other leaders. At just 34 years old, he became the world's youngest president. Many called him bold. Others called him dangerous. But to the youth of Africa, Traoré became a symbol of courage, of resistance, and of hope. Burkina Faso had been fighting deadly terrorist attacks for years. Villages were burned. Schools were closed. Families were displaced. People were tired of politicians who made speeches but never took action. Then came Traoré. In September 2022, he led a military coup, ousting the government he said had failed to protect the people. He didn't wear fancy suits. He wore army boots and spoke directly to the youth. His message was clear: we must take our destiny into our own hands. Some African leaders distanced themselves. Western countries watched nervously. But young Africans, especially in Mali, Guinea, and Niger, started to look up to him. They shared his speeches online. They painted his face on murals. They started to dream of an Africa that could stand tall without depending on foreign powers. Under Traoré, Burkina Faso cut ties with France, expelled French troops, and embraced a more Pan-African approach. He spoke often about Africa's need to unite, control its resources, and end foreign interference. But can one man really lead Africa to new heights? The truth is, Traoré cannot do it alone. He has passion, yes, but he needs peace. He needs unity. He needs other leaders who believe in Africa's future. If he can inspire that kind of unity, not through war but through purpose, then maybe, just maybe, he could help Africa rise. The question remains: will Ibrahim Traoré be remembered as a rebel, or as a reformer who changed the course of African history? Only time will tell. Traoré didn't waste time after taking power. He visited villages that had been abandoned due to attacks. He sat with elders under mango trees. He listened to mothers who had lost their sons, and young boys who no longer went to school because their classrooms had become battlegrounds. He didn't promise magic. He promised struggle and a new kind of fight, not just with guns, but with vision. He started pushing for self-reliance. He encouraged farmers to grow more food and reduce dependency on imported goods. He told the youth to go back to the land, to take pride in farming and building. His government began working with local vigilante groups to protect rural areas. These groups, once ignored, were now being trained and supported. But not everyone was happy. Some in the capital whispered that Traoré was too extreme. He was cutting too many international ties. Aid money was drying up. The media started to call him a dictator in disguise. Western diplomats expressed concern over press freedom and democratic backsliding. Yet, in the streets of Ouagadougou, people still chanted his name. Something had changed in the hearts of many Africans watching him from afar. Young people in Ghana, Senegal, and even as far as South Africa began to ask, what if we had leaders like Traoré? What if we stopped waiting for help and started building from within? He met with leaders from Mali and Niger. Together, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a military and political union focused on defending their lands and cutting off old colonial influences. Some called it a dangerous game. Others called it the beginning of African independence for real. In schoolyards across West Africa, children began to draw the Burkinabe flag next to their own. Young musicians started singing songs of African unity. A new idea was being born, one where Africa was no longer seen as a land of poverty and war, but of strength, dignity, and purpose. But Ibrahim Traoré knew the road ahead would not be easy. He still faced rebel attacks in the north. He still had limited resources. He still had powerful enemies who preferred Africa divided and weak. Still, every morning he woke up and reminded his people, our strength is not in what we have, but in what we believe. If we believe in ourselves, no one can stop us. And so, the journey continued, but behind Traoré's brave speeches and growing support, dark clouds were gathering. Foreign powers that once had easy access to Africa's gold, uranium, and oil were beginning to feel uncomfortable. Traoré had not just kicked out soldiers, he had kicked out influence. French military bases were emptied. Their flags were lowered. Western mining contracts were being reviewed. New deals were now going to countries in the East. Some called it betrayal. Others called it balance. In response, rumors began to spread. Some said there were plots to remove him. Some claimed foreign-backed groups were working with local politicians to cause division. Explosions began again in some villages. Weapons flooded in from unknown sources. The old game of divide and conquer was back on the table. But Traoré didn't blink. He gathered his cabinet, mostly young, new voices from universities and grassroots movements. He told them, "We are not just fighting for Burkina Faso. We are fighting for every forgotten child in Africa. If we fail, we teach them that resistance has no reward." To strengthen their defense, Traoré looked to traditional leaders, the old griots, the village chiefs, the spirit priests. He asked for unity, not just in politics but in soul. He said, "Let our ancestors walk with us in this fight." And something strange began to happen. Militias who had once refused to cooperate started pledging loyalty. People began volunteering to rebuild bridges and roads without being paid. Women formed food banks in rural areas. School teachers returned to ghost towns. Slowly, a kind of silent revolution was growing, not with guns but with belief. Traoré then turned his eyes beyond Burkina Faso. He started calling on African youth everywhere. He gave speeches on radio stations in Niger, Mali, and Togo. His words echoed across WhatsApp groups and Telegram channels. Africa must stop being a playground for others. Our destiny is not in Paris. It's not in Washington. It's not in Beijing. It's in Bamako, in Ouagadougou, in Lagos, in Kinshasa, in you. Youth began organizing their own local groups. Some cleaned streets, others taught children, others guarded villages at night. They didn't call it politics anymore. They called it the African awakening. But Traoré knew what often followed an awakening: resistance. And in the dark corners of global power, meetings were being held. Files were opened, and plans were being made. Because when one young man wakes up Africa, the world pays attention. Traoré began to feel the weight of what he had started. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. Across the continent, from Nairobi to Accra, from Kampala to Harare, his name had become a symbol. Not of a president, but of an idea, an Africa that no longer begged, but built. But the enemy was no longer just outside. Some of the elite in his own country, businessmen, old political families, and army officers who had lost their power, were quietly working to undo what he had started. They met in secret, whispered in hotel rooms, and sent messages to foreign embassies. "Traoré is a danger to stability," they said. "He is turning the youth against us." One day, as Traoré visited a school being rebuilt in the north, a soldier close to him received intel. A coup was being planned, not by rebels, not by terrorists, but by men in suits, educated, well-connected, and hungry for the old ways to return. Traoré didn't panic. He gathered his most trusted people that night under the stars. He sat on a mat, not a throne. No camera, no microphone, just truth. "We are not safe anymore, but we are right. They will try to stop us because they fear what we represent. But we cannot go back. If I fall, you must rise." The next morning, he made a bold move. He walked into the national radio station and spoke live to the nation. His voice was calm, but sharp. "There are people among us who miss the days of corruption. They miss the foreign money, the free trips, the big contracts. But we are building something greater. A future where your children don't have to leave Africa to live well." The people responded. Thousands poured into the streets in support. They sang, they danced, they held signs that read "Africa is waking up," and "Traoré is not alone." Markets paused. Teachers brought students out to chant. Old women raised their fists. Young men swore to protect him. The coup never happened. The message was clear. The people had spoken. But the pressure from outside kept growing. Sanctions were announced. Aid was frozen. Foreign companies began to pull out. Yet Traoré did something unexpected. He said, "Let them go." He turned to African scientists, engineers, farmers, and entrepreneurs. He launched a bold new plan: Build with what we have. Solar panels made by local youth began powering small towns. New farming cooperatives were launched. Schools taught African history, not colonial lies. A network of African-owned businesses began to rise. It was slow. It was hard. But it was real. He wasn't just leading a country anymore. He was trying to shape a new African mindset. Other leaders began to watch more carefully. Some feared his popularity. Others were inspired. Quiet meetings were held in Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry. Leaders whispered, "What if we joined forces? What if we built something the world has never seen?" And so, behind the scenes, the dream of a united Africa began to stir again. Not on paper, not with flags, but in the hearts of a generation that refused to accept the past as their only future. And at the center of it all stood the boyish-faced soldier from Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. As the winds of unity spread, whispers of something greater began to form. A new African bloc. Not just political, not just military, but economic, cultural, and spiritual. Behind closed doors in Mali, Traoré met with Colonel Assimi Goïta. In Niger, he shared long talks with Abdourahmane Tiani. These were not just photo ops. These were real conversations. About trade, about defense, about breaking old chains and writing new rules. They called it the Alliance of Sahel Nations. But in private, they spoke of something even bigger. The Federation of Free African States. A single passport. A shared currency backed by gold. Not by foreign banks. Borderless movement between member states. Shared energy projects. And one unified army to defend the land. Not from each other, but from those who had always taken from it. It sounded like a dream. But dreams, in the hands of the determined, become plans. Traoré sent secret teams to study Rwanda's tech policies. He sent youth ambassadors to Senegal to learn how to build agricultural cooperatives. He brought back doctors from Sudan and engineers from Ethiopia. The vision was not to replace the West or East. It was to stand beside them, not beneath them. But not everyone liked the sound of a strong, united Africa. In the early hours of a quiet morning, a drone flew low over a training base in northern Burkina Faso and exploded. 5 soldiers died. Traoré was not there. But the message was clear. This was not a local fight anymore. Someone from outside was watching, and they were getting nervous. The Burkina Faso government accused external actors. No names, but the people had their own guesses. That night, Traoré appeared on national TV again. His tone was different this time, not just brave, but wounded. They have started again. Bombs instead of talks. Fear instead of respect. But we will not run. We will not stop. For every one of us they try to silence, thousands more will speak. The youth responded like fire. They formed community patrols. They protected hospitals. They carried sandbags. They shared food. They shared hope. In the markets, women began saying, "We are all Traoré now." Even musicians in Nigeria and Kenya began releasing protest songs. Afrobeat and reggae artists dropped lyrics about Pan-African strength. In Congo, dancers held rallies with painted faces of African freedom fighters. The names of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba returned to everyday conversations. The dream was no longer one man's. It had taken root. But as Traoré looked across the continent, he saw 2 things clearly: light and shadow. There were leaders ready to rise, and others waiting to betray. A letter arrived from a powerful African president who had long stayed silent. The message was short. "Brother, I admire your courage, but courage without caution leads to chaos. Be careful who sits beside you. Not all Africans wear African hearts." And Traoré understood something he had always feared. The next great war would not be between Africa and the outside world. It would be fought within Africa itself. Between the old and the new. Between fear and freedom. Between silence and voice. And the drums of that war had just begun to beat. The beat of resistance echoed louder with each passing day. In Ghana, students marched holding signs that read, "Africa for Africans." In South Africa, Ex-miners joined youth leaders to talk about building back communities. In Nigeria, market women raised funds to support local farmers instead of importing foreign goods. Across the continent, the wind of change was blowing, but not everyone stood firm. Traoré began to notice the cracks. A trusted general was caught secretly negotiating with foreign diplomats. A former Pan-African ally turned against him for promises of power. Some leaders, fearing for their comfort and safety, began sabotaging the union from the inside. And then, the unthinkable happened. During a public address in Ouagadougou, a sniper's shot rang out. Panic erupted. Soldiers rushed the podium. Blood stained the ground. Traoré had been hit, but before he lost consciousness, he whispered into the mic, "Africa, don't stop." He survived, but just barely. The bullet had shattered his body, but not his spirit. He spent months recovering, watching from a hospital bed as chaos tried to return. But something had changed. The people did not give up. In his absence, the youth led marches. Women ran local governments. Villagers protected their own from bandits. Across borders, Africans held onto the dream Traoré had helped plant. Eventually, Traoré returned, older, slower, but sharper. His scars now reminded him of a deeper truth. One man cannot save Africa, but one idea believed by many can. At a massive Pan-African summit held in Mali, with thousands present and millions watching, Traoré stood one last time before the world and said, "I am not your hero. I am your mirror. What you see in me, bravery, sacrifice, hope, it lives in all of you. Africa will rise, not when we wait for leaders to save us, but when we become the leaders we seek." And with those words, he stepped down from power, not forced, not overthrown, but by choice. He returned to his village, where he taught children history, planted yams, and walked barefoot through his community. But his legacy remained. The African bloc survived. Some countries left, some joined. Mistakes were made, but progress continued. People began to think differently, to vote differently, to dream differently. Africa will not rise because of one man. Africa will rise when her people choose unity over greed, truth over comfort, and action over waiting. The enemies of Africa are no longer just outsiders, but also the silence, fear, and division within. Traoré's story is a reminder. You don't need to wear a crown to lead. You only need the courage to act, the heart to love your land, and the will to never give up on Africa.